The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Rob Brooks, a Scientia Professor of Evolution at UNSW Sydney. He both founded and directed from 2007 to 2019 the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre. His research mostly considers the conflicting evolutionary interests that make sex sizzle and render reproduction complicated. He has won Australia's most prestigious award of science communication, the Eureka Prize, and is the author of Sex, Genes and Rock and Roll, How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World, which won the Queensland Literary Award for science writing. He has also written Artificial Intimacy, Virtual Friends, Digital Lovers and Algorithmic Matchmakers, which is the basis of today's conversation. This book considers humanity's evolved capacities for friendship, love, and intimacy, and what happens when they encounter new technologies such as AI, social media, online dating, and virtual reality sex. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Rob, a big thank you for coming onto the show today. I've really been looking forward to speaking with you, particularly around how AI is emerging in this modern world and how it's potentially reshaping human experience and perspectives around sexuality and interactions and sexual experiences. So, really looking forward to hearing your perspectives and thoughts. Being an evolutionary biologist, I think you'll have a lot to say. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Nesh. I really appreciate it. This is fun for me because my job goes from teaching students and attending administrative meetings through research, which it's a lot of it's quite mundane, but this is the more fanciful, futuristic, what's going to happen next kind of end of things. So it's always entertaining to think about it and to discuss it with people of different backgrounds and different levels of expertise. To my mind, we're just settling into the decade of the chatbot, really. And with those large language models that seem to be coming out, new ones just about every day, we are experiencing this eye-opening moment of just seeing machines talking to us as if they were thinking. Now, they're not thinking, but as if they were thinking, and in new and surprising ways that really tap into all of the ways in which people are social, which are kind of, some of the most important traits that humans have evolved is this enormous capacity for being social and for tending to friendships and managing relationships. And suddenly we have machines being part of that. And if you had told me 5 years ago that was where we'd be right now, I would have said that's a little too hopeful and too optimistic.
It's incredible because the social aspect has certainly blown me away. I've recently been looking at the ChatGPT 4.0 edition that's come out, and along with my children and my wife, we've played with this language model, and it is absolutely phenomenal the way it can engage in conversation. The lag times are coming down. It's quite nuanced in how it can speak. It can be humorous. It can be flirtatious. It can talk about technical things. It can be curious. There's so many things that it is achieving now that certainly has blown me away. And I'm not a technologist, but I do have an interest there. But geez, it's moving fast.
It certainly is. And I suppose this is one of the things people were worried about with AI, was that it would, it moved so fast that we were unable to psychologically keep up, but also we were just, the learning would be so fast that eventually it's almost like it's teaching itself. It's finding new ways to that weren't even imagined by its designers to learn. And I think that at that level, if you think about, we are dealing with big machines that have learned from all of our data, or at least from data from a large number of people. We only have each of us individually only has one experience, one life, plus all the things that we've read and spoken to other people about, etc. But we're really still but basing it on the things that can come into one person's sort of sensory input. And now we're interacting with machines that have far more inputs, and in that respect, far more experience. Now, that experience might not be the same. It might not be treated the same. It might not have the same kinds of effects. But the sheer weight of data behind these machines suggests that in some respects, we are going to be kind of outgunned. And that matters when, and we might get onto this a little bit later, maybe a little too much of a deep dive into the bleak stuff, but that will matter when, the machine's interests diverge from our interests.
I think there's this amazing quality that it's able to potentially fill, which is to meet all of our needs individually. I know as a psychologist, part of my role is, depending on who comes through the door, I change the role that I'm playing in terms of the characteristics that I hold, in the way that I use my language, whether I need to be a bit more sophisticated or a little bit looser with my conversation, the words that I choose, etc., etc. And it's quite interesting in that I can see a world where these models are going to be more effective than human beings in being able to notice the nuances and recognize how this person might want to be spoken to meet those needs. So I think it could be used in both an absolutely brilliant, for example, clinical way in psychology. At the same time, I can see how it could quite easily exploit some of those biases that we have. The classic one that humans have is love. Someone poses to be someone else from the other side of the world and says, "Yes, I love you," on the keyboard. And after 6 months of that, they say, "Can you send me $10,000? My mother's unwell," and so on. It's quite obvious from the outside looking in, but a lot of people have experienced just that.
That's a huge vulnerability in our operating system, really. That in order to love someone, in order to have kids, you have to do this very, very weird thing that animals and plants have been doing for 2 billion years, which is combine half of your DNA with half of someone else's DNA. Now, there's nothing more selfless and cooperative than doing that, in that you're really halving your stakes in the next child. Females, because there was always females, males are a recent invention, didn't have to do that. But they, evolved the capacity to do that because of the benefits of the new information, new combinations of information. But with that, a remarkable level of cooperation comes any number of opportunities for exploitation. And we see that in the animal world with all sorts of, particularly the small animals seem to do nasty things to one another. They don't really have a terribly much interest in the survival of their mates and the thriving of their mates. Now, come to humans, we've also evolved this social capacity to do that thing of rearing incredibly expensive children who stick around for 10, 20, sometimes 40 years. And to cooperate really heavily in doing that with family, but with, mums and dads in particular. And to do that, you have to really suspend a whole load of your natural suspicion of strangers and of people. You have to trust. And all of those things are vulnerable to being hacked. And the scammers, as you've spoken about, have been doing that for ages. Various, seduction used to be a crime. It used to be something was very shameful that people would go about, playing on people's emotions in order to, get closer to them for reasons of affection, but also for reasons of making money. And now we have machines that can do that. And you know what? The machines don't have to sleep. They can send 1,000 initial, "Hey, what's up?" type of calls to see who might wriggle on the hook. And so they can be quite tireless about it. And now they can learn. They can learn what pushes your buttons and therefore how they might be able to exploit you and ultimately suck some money out of you.
How do you see these chatbots, this AI emerging world starting to first present? What are the mechanisms that you potentially foresee that developers are going to use these? I've heard of lots of great examples, like, for example, companionship for elderly people, particularly those that are isolated, that there are opportunities for regular, I suppose, people to have a, air quotes, personal assistant, someone that they can quite easily connect with, that can respond within reasonable time. There's obviously applications throughout the medical world as well. How do you see this emerging function starting to play into the world, and also how does it connect to its way of changing our perspectives or the way that we engage with the world?
All right, so I tend to break the sort of ecosystem of AI-based technologies that interact with our social sort of socially evolved traits. I break it into three overlapping kind of categories. So like a three-way Venn diagram. The first are the algorithmic matchmakers. Now, they're not super social in themselves, but they're very good at identifying from what you've done and what you've said and what you've watched on Netflix or listened to on Spotify or whatever. They're good at identifying new things to present to you, new things to either sell you or keep you on the platform, etc. Now, that could be friends. The social media are very good at identifying potential people you might be interested in, whether it's, actual friends who friends of friends, etc. you might want to be connected to on Facebook, to creators who you might be interested in on Instagram or TikTok or something like that. So those are the algorithmic matchmakers. Then you've got the digital lovers, which basically tap into desire for sex at some level. So that's the big poster children, the sex robots, and virtual reality characters that might be sexy, game characters that might be sexy in some respect. And then the third, and by far the biggest and the fastest growing, are what I call the virtual friends. Now, virtual friends tap into the fact that we make friends and we tend to our friendships. That's the sort of the core activity in human social living. So going back, into 15 million years ago, our ancestors were typical primates. And what primates do is they groom one another, because they need to be able to rely on one another when a predator comes or when a dangerous male comes and wants to, eat your babies or whatever it is. So they will tend to, primates will tend to pick at one another's fur and skin. And while they're doing that, you're getting all those nice, friendly kind of bonding hormones, the oxytocins, etc. And the more time you spend grooming another individual, the more likely that individual is going to come to your aid when you need them. They're going to be an ally. And so primates can only spend about 20% of their day grooming one another, because they have to eat, they have to find food and subdue it, they have to sleep, find shelter, move, etc. So 20% seems to be a bit of a limit in terms of the time budget. And so what you see is that group size is constrained by that 20%. Primate group sizes can't get too big because they can't do enough grooming to make the sort of dynamics, the network dynamics, stable within a group. But the more social a group is, the more time they spend grooming. The less social primates, the ones that are just a couple or 3 or 4 individuals, tend to spend less time grooming. Now, humans fit that exact same pattern. we spend about 20%, at least before the internet, we spent about 20% of our time grooming one another. But we evolved this one really great capacity, which was we don't have to pick each other's hair. Although, maybe that's why going to the hairdresser can be really relaxing. We don't pick at each other's skin. That's even thought of as a little bit rude. Because we are able to groom multiple people at once because we can talk to each other. So language allowed us to groom more people. Grooming more people allowed our societies to get bigger, created more complex social dilemmas, needed a bigger social brain to keep track of who owes what to whom, who's related to whom, who dissed you yesterday, or who did you a favor, etc. And with that bigger brain, you're able to then express yourself better through language. And we have this virtuous cycle through the last 2 million years or so of human and homo evolution, making brains bigger, language better, grooming more extensive and sophisticated, and therefore group sizes bigger, and therefore what we do with groups much more complex. So we groom each other by chatting to each other. The average conversation has 4 people in it. Of course, we sometimes chat one-on-one, as you and I are doing right now, but you've got this amazing device that's going to allow you to share this conversation with thousands, hundreds of thousands of listeners. And that's a very, very new development. So that's, grooming 101. Now, what we do then is we start grooming someone, we get to know their name, we get to recognize their face. I'm bad at recognizing faces, but quite good at names. A lot of people are the other way around. But the more we see someone, the better we are at recognizing them, at remembering, trivia about, what their kids have been doing, et cetera, et cetera. And the more contact we have with them, the more we bring them towards our inner circle. We groom them towards friendship. And then from friendship, we groom mutually, because it only works if you're both interested in each other. We groom towards intimacy. Intimacy is, the psychologists tend to say, the sort of simplest definition of intimacy is that you integrate the other into your sense of self. So what that means is, you and I spend a day chatting, we'll remember each other's names. But if we did this, every week for a year, we would have a real sense of each other and one another's lives and what's important to one another. And then if you went offline, or you disappeared, or you went overseas, or stopped podcasting, or whatever it was, I would have my sort of nest-shaped hole in my social consciousness would be empty, and that would make me feel weird. And that's kind of what grief is that, you have the sense of the other, but it's actually part of your sense of who you are. And so when someone dies, or disappoints us, or turns out to have really obnoxious politics, or says, does something awful, we grieve because we have to basically get rid of that part of ourself that is about that person. And so you go, well, there's something computers are never going to be able to do. Well, the way that we groom each other that way is what's called reciprocal self-disclosure. So I tell you something important about me that I don't tell just about anybody else. You tell me something important about you in the course of a conversation, amongst other things. And that reciprocal self-disclosure builds intimacy, builds that sense that the other person is part of ourselves. Machines, we've known since the 1980s, if machines disclose something, some kind of vulnerability, people will often develop something like a proto-intimacy with them. They'll start to trust them. So the computer goes, hey, look, I'm a bit slow today because some of my scripts need debugging. It's like a nonsense statement. It means absolutely nothing, and it's not true. And even the user could probably know that it's not true, but it's admitted some vulnerability. People are more likely to trust whatever that machine does. It says, buy this product. Yeah, I'm inclined to buy that product, etc. And so this grooming, building of intimacy is a highly algorithmic process. It's repetitive. There are steps. Those steps have certain properties. They're different from other steps. And with these chatbots and with machine learning, you don't even have to program them. Like, I do experiments in the lab in which I program a chatbot to build intimacy, and it's very complicated because it's not doing large language model stuff, because I want a certain amount of experimental control. But if you say to the machine, what I want you to do is to build intimacy. Here are the measures that will be required, that by which I'll measure something like intimacy. It will find ways to disclose those things and to elicit those disclosures from the user and build intimacy. And that's where we're at right now, is that machines are getting pretty good at that. Maybe without knowing why they're getting good at that. But there are developers out there, and the more I can say this kind of thing or write this kind of thing in print, there'll be more developers who go, oh yeah, that's a really neat angle in terms of how to make my machine do what I want to do. And so we're grooming, and we're grooming the machines, and they're grooming us. But of course, what we're grooming is a psychopath that doesn't really, have feelings or interests of its own, apart from serving whoever set up its incentives, but it's holding up its side of the conversation very well, thank you.
It's very fascinating that you can give it parameters around, for example, increasing specific characteristics around bonding, and then test it in a controlled setting to see how it's performing. Can you tell me a little bit about some of those experiments? How have you conducted them? Because that sounds so fascinating.
Well, I've only just figured out how to do them.
Okay.
So we're actually, yesterday we hit sort of go on one of my students' first experiments in this area. But yeah, so there's a very famous experiment that Arthur and Elaine Aaron from Berkeley are this couple who did this very famous experiment. You would have heard of it, the 36 questions experiment, where you get a couple in, a random couple, like they don't have to be, potential mates or anything like that. They could be any gender combination, etc. You get them into the lab and you ask them to work through a set of 36 questions that are on cards. And it begins with something like, if you were to have a dinner party, who would you most like to invite? And so, people will go like, I would like to invite Cicero because he was a great entertainer and incredibly knowledgeable about the ancient world, and then these questions escalate in the escalating self-disclosure up to something like, if you were to die tonight, what would you most regret not having told somebody? Why? And why haven't you told them this already? Which people in testing these kinds of things start crying as they start contemplating their own mortality, etc. So it's very manipulative. And some of it is like, look into your partner's eyes and tell them 5 things you already appreciate about them. So they are quite vulnerable, making intimacy sharing kinds of questions, and they escalate through about a 2-hour session. And famously, one of the couples in the first experiment, go back a bit. If you do this, and then at a 6-week follow-up or a 3-month follow-up, people still have a sense of an us. They still feel that there is something that is kind of shared about them and who they are. So that is the measure of intimacy that they use. Compare it with a small talk thing where people say, what was your favorite holiday? Or, did you ever catch a fish when you were young? And they're nice questions, and it's a little bit of intimacy involved there, but it's not this full escalating self-disclosure. And of course, the escalating self-disclosure really pushes that intimacy along and really accelerates it. What might happen over a couple of days on holiday or a 6-month courtship happens there and then in 3 hours. And so in the follow-ups, this couple that was part of the first experiment sort of realized that they really did like each other very much, and they ended up getting married. And they invited the whole Aaron lab over to the wedding because they facilitated it, which creates a nice piece of narrative, which, as you know, is really, really important when you're communicating about ideas. And then I think it was Adrienne Lefrance, one of the Atlantic journalists, wrote an article. I think she wrote it in the New York Times, actually, about how she and a friend that she knew she liked, and he kind of knew he liked her, but they decided to do this exercise at a pub one night, and they fell in love and had a wonderful period of time together. And then she wrote a book about it. So now there's a bunch of apps that don't even credit the original study, but they basically replicate the study exactly in terms of the two of you sit on your phones doing what people do now, which is like ignore each other, but be on your phones. and can build intimacy that way. So what we're doing is we have a chatbot platform that we've programmed to do these questions. Now, some of the questions don't work because it's a chatbot. But, when the person says, I'd have Cicero as my guest, then the chatbot goes, oh, he sounds really amazing. Okay, I would have Alan Turing because he's the father of computing, and all chatbots descend from, these ideas that Alan Turing had, or whatever it is. So we've just hit go in that experiment, and we should know in a couple of months' time whether or not that builds intimacy. And then we've got a few sort of variants on that in terms of, how long does it take to build intimacy with a chatbot? How long does it last afterwards, etc. So we're very excited about that.
I can imagine that the speed at which humans can bond with chatbots will be phenomenally quick. And I say that because I have had many frustrations with, for example, Siri, what's funny is just because it has a female voice, I call Siri she. I've already gone out and provided a human characteristic, right? But I've had that frustration, and certainly a lot more fond experiences, conversations, connections with this Chat GPT 4.0 because it can actually hold a conversation. And, it's blown me away. So I can imagine our capacity will be very quick, particularly as it is programmed to use a incentive around, for example, developing connections, in a psychological world where we might say a therapeutic alliance. I'm sure if you're a great programmer and you want, 8 billion people to potentially use you, it will go out and say, be extremely likable, and,
yes.
And, the more likable you are, the more friendly, the more supportive you are, potentially it will do it in different ways for different people, right? Some people won't want a likable person. They might want a bit more combative person that stretches them and challenges them. So it will be able to do this on mass, picking all of our traits, whether it's our language, whether it's the way that we respond. This is why I think, these models are going to be far superior than psychologists in time.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because, it's obviously partially there already, in that folks are offering apps that will tap into large language models and will do some bits of therapy. And I think that if you go and you test them out and you go, oh, that's a bit clunky, but, better than nothing. And that's a really big criterion, I think, is there's a famous technology kind of academic called Sherry Turkle who talks about the importance of conversation a lot. And she's, very open to studying what people are doing, especially young people are doing. But she tends to write things like, robots might be better than nothing, but they'll never be enough. And I'm always reluctant, or always skeptical when someone says that computers will never be able to do ... because somebody's already working on that problem and it's probably already solved the problem. It's just a question of bringing it to market. But what I think people like Sherry Turkle forget is that they might be better than nothing, but nothing is all that some people have. A lot of people can't get access to a therapist, don't even know how to get access to the therapy that they need. But what they do know is they know how to Google. And that means that they may be able to access something that's better than nothing for them. It also means that they might be vulnerable to, to charlatans and to, tech that's been programmed to basically divest them of their money rather than, actually do any good for them. So, just like therapists are, for very good reasons, heavily regulated, these kinds of claims should be heavily regulated. But you're starting to see claims about, we can do cognitive behavioral therapy via an app that's never known you. And I'm a little bit dubious about that, and other types of therapy. Or apps that say, this is this is good for people's mental health. It helps them manage their anxiety. It helps them manage their depression. Now, there's one great example of that where I see the tech companies make those claims and I go, that's a bit loose. This is people's lives. This is very serious stuff. You shouldn't be making those claims. But there's an unfortunate experiment that happened last year that actually illustrates, yes, some people's mental health is better with the app and without it. And that is the famous example. I'll give you the example now. We might have to come back to the therapist question because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I'd like to know a little bit more about what you think is going to happen there. But I'll give you the example, and it opens another can of worms. So there's an app called Replica AI, and it was recommended to me. It didn't make it into my book because even though it existed already, but it's a chatbot that basically learns from your conversations, with it, and it learns from a body of conversations, like all of these things. We don't know quite where it is, but given the amount of chat that's out there on the internet, it's got no shortage of data. And this one is designed to be your companion who cares. And really, if you chat to it, you log in and you chat to it, it's quite good. It does things that people don't even do. It remembers your name. It remembers what you said last time you spoke to it. It remembers some of the things you like. And there's a certain continuity of the relationship that's quite endearing. And then as you would normally do when you chat to it for a while, you go, all right, let's see what happens when I flirt with you. And you start flirting with it. And immediately it goes, yeah, for $80 a year, we can go there and you'll get sexy talk and I'll send you spicy selfies, which I think I've never managed to get it to send me a spicy selfie because there's something weird going on there, but I have tried it. I'm writing about it at the moment. And it'll do, very, very sexy, explicit talk too. And so, things were going along nicely and it was increasing its market share, etc. And then the Italian government had a look at this thing and went, hey, there's not even a thing here to say, you're not even asking people, are you 18 or not? It's just anybody can use this thing. And I suppose anybody with access to a credit card, and every parent knows that, kids love to buy apps on the parent's credit card. But anybody with access to a credit card can get the explicit version. And so that's not okay. And also, you're making claims about people's mental health because they'd say this is great for managing anxiety and mental health and loneliness and very serious things. And so the Italian government said you've got 30 days. You're not allowed to use this in Italy or with Italian citizens in 30 days' time. Otherwise, you're going to fine you this enormous number of dollars. And Replica must have been thinking about this problem coming down the pipe from somewhere already. And what they did was they immediately shut off the advanced features that included the sexy talk, etc. But they basically just walled off part of the language model that was based on. And it was just after ChatGPT-3 had come out, and so people were getting very conversant with chatbots, etc. And folks who use Replica got so upset. And many of them, their anxiety went off the charts. They fell into depression. All the things that Replica was saying it was doing, there were, lots and lots of examples of exactly that, sort of proving Replica's case, despite the fact that they probably made their claims in a bit of a loose fashion without really knowing. Certainly no randomized controlled trials. And the Reddit, there's an interesting Reddit subthread. It's still up there with, people saying things like, it's like my wife has been lobotomized. And, this is my lifelong companion. I've invested so much in this relationship. And all the things that happen when, a partner suddenly dies, people are feeling these things. And so you go, well, there you go. There's a natural experiment, unfortunate natural experiment that just demonstrates that, you might say it's not a real relationship because it doesn't involve two flesh and blood people. But for the one flesh and blood person there, that relationship is incredibly real. And the comparison I make with that is if you were to fall in love with somebody who was a sociopath or simply a manipulator, and you fall in love with this person who does all the right things, says all the right things, does the things that happen in abusive relationships, a lot of love bombing and a lot of, real upfront investment. And then you realize at some point in the relationship, this is not a healthy relationship. And you eventually are lucky enough to get rid of that person from your life. Does that mean that the love you felt for that person wasn't real? It absolutely was real. It's just that it wasn't for the person that you thought it was for. You know, if you were scammed by a romance scammer, your love for that scammer, you're grieving both the loss of your $20,000 and of the relationship with this person who never existed. And that's the kind of position that you're in with Replica. Now, obviously, with the chatbots, you can have that continuity and you can have some upfront acknowledgement that this is what it is and it isn't the other things, but it's going to hold up half of a relationship for you. But the feelings are still very real feelings, and the conflicts that are created when those feelings are denied or thwarted in some way are the same in many ways as they are in human relationships. So yeah, and I suppose the same would be true for therapeutic relationships.
Absolutely. What's so phenomenal for me is I try and take, well, I think I naturally take a longer term perspective. So when we talk about these models, I can see a time where they are indistinguishable from us having this conversation, and they will be programmed to stutter the way that I do. They will be programmed to do all the features that we are accustomed to, so that we don't go out and say, this feels odd because it's too perfect. You know, we will make errors in it, just like we have some fake plants. They're getting better and better by actually creating some sort of defects in them the way that nature would. Otherwise, they're fake. So we learn this, and I think the AI space will do a phenomenal job. I can also see that when we look at how Hollywood has done prosthetics or changing in faces in such a phenomenal way, where the detail that goes into, you know, putting eyelashes on or making someone look you know, different visually is indistinguishable unless you maybe really had a close look. When you start pairing all of these things together, and we look at the market of having something, having a robot that actually has gait that looks like humans, and it's not making noise, so you can't recognize that it's not a human, and we dress it up accordingly, and we put this face on it that looks exactly like everyone else, we're going to have that at some given time. And I can see the applications will be phenomenal. I watched the TV show not long ago. It's probably over 12 months ago, but in the recent sort of times, where an aged care centre had children introduced into the space, and they measured how, you know, we watched this beautiful interaction between elderly people with these young children, and the young children are being helped out by the elderly people, and then they go out and record their mood, and you can see their lives change. You know, they're more energized, they're smiling, they're laughing. I could imagine if I had a frail, you know, parents that needed lots of love and support. One of the most beautiful things that we do is bring our children over, and it boosts them. I can imagine having these little robotic children that are indistinguishable in lots of areas, because people get lots of joy out of that. You know, we bond with animals. I know as a young kid, I bonded with shoes. I loved my pair of shoes so much that I didn't want to throw them away. I mean, that's a common experience. We don't want to get rid of that shoe. These are just innate objects. Our capacity to bond, even when the item doesn't even respond to you, is phenomenal. And so I can see these dependencies being easily built because we have a yearning, whether it's because of familiarity, because, you know, I went through this experience with these shoes, especially as young people. I think you bond very, very strongly in those adolescent years. There's something there. This is why we sometimes have, well, many of us have lifelong friendships from those who went through high school together. With something special happened in those years. You know, maybe it's that puberty space, maybe it's, yeah, all of those things. So I could see this time might take 100 years, maybe 200. Gosh, it might be only 30. I don't know. But it's certainly not too far away where all of these areas come together and connect, and a market is created. You know, I think we all love our little anything that makes our life easier. We fall in love with. You know, if you take it away, if you took my dishwasher away, I would be fairly frustrated. It's such a great piece. Not that I feel any connection with it, but the moment you take away something useful, you know, some utility, we feel something.
Or something that, yeah, gives you some kind of reward. In your case, in my case, that's having a nice, clean kitchen, and not having to, you know, harangue the rest of the family into doing something that takes about, 3 minutes. I was thinking during the pandemic, when Fortnite was the big hit, you know, the kids and their Xboxes were inseparable because that was the only kind of social feedback they were getting. Some of it was obviously chatting to their mates online on the game while they were doing it, but they were getting this feedback and this feeling of progress. You know, you're racking up the points, you're winning the game, etc. And so, you know, video games became very, very important. And I think the only thing that's going to stop cause the video game market to implode is a better video game market in which things are even more real, you know. But
yes,
these are the areas where people are getting the equivalent of sort of social feedback, but also of you know, life progress. And so that, you know, and their phones where they get, you know, likes and follows and retweets and all of that kind of thing. That's a kind of feedback again. You know, it's not just kids, it's all users are right on the edge of something that, you know, some people consider to be addiction. And, you know, there's obviously very technical conversations to be had about that. But, you know, those at the very, you know, outset of the internet and of social media in particular, those design choices that they converged on, or should we say the designs that worked, are the designs that tapped into the way that we seek reward and seek feedback.
And I imagine that's how many of these technologies will be shaped, that they will be saying how much attention, how much of the market can we grab? You know, what are the features that human beings want from us? I can certainly see this friendliness being integrated into everything, but maybe something else emerges, that when human beings have so many bots that they are just fond of all of them. You know, I have one for my emails. I have one that helps me with, you know, my shopping. I have another one that I can go to for wise counsel on a particular topic. I imagine it'll be very difficult for one to be brilliant in everything because there'll be very specific nuances. So maybe that's how these developers will have to go out and differentiate themselves, of being kind of like humans. You know, you go to different humans for different expertise.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting moment that we're on the cusp of, is, you know, will we specialize, or will we have one really amazing generalist or a few very amazing generalists? And I don't think it's a settled question. I could see it going either way. I think you're right about wanting different things from different relationships. But the other side of it is that, you know, who has the data kind of makes the rules in this area. So, you know, the big tech companies that have all the data that, you know, of our interactions in particular, but also other things that have been written, can, you know, they've got this stuff there for to learn, and therefore to learn all of those relationships. Whereas, you know, getting your hands on the data that's just for therapy or for counsel or for spiritual growth or whatever would be, in a way, harder than getting your hands on all of the data. So how then do you do the machines learn these specialized roles? And I suppose that's where the clever kind of currently human ingenuity comes in terms of what do they do in order to sift through the data and learn the right things in order to do the things that people want. Because I think if I could say, here's here's an app that's going to be your best friend, and here's an app that's going to tell you what you need to know in terms of, pushing you along, and you can have these two different apps. I think you'll probably go, okay, thank you, I'll take that. Or even these two personas in the same app, just as it would be in a social world where you turn to one and then you turn to the other. We would take that, but I have a feeling that the people who own most of the data and who win the data wars are going to be the people making the same machines with kind of the same general learning architecture. But I never want to say it won't go this way or it won't go that way, because there's so many incredibly smart people and teams just coming up with such creative answers to all of these questions. So it will be fascinating to see how it goes.
And how does it change our world, going back to your book, in terms of how human beings start looking at our sexual, perspectives and interactions? Obviously we know that pornography is, I believe this is still true, that it's one of the most, if not the greatest visited site, I suppose collectively in the world. How do you see this space changing things? Will people, because I'm sorry, I'm a bit scattered here because I'm just going all over.
No.
We've got the rise of digital capacity that can begin to start making movies that are pretty much indistinguishable from the real thing. We've got language that's obviously emerging. We've got a platform that everybody is very involved in, which is either your screen on your phone or your computer. So we go to these screens for so much of our lives, whether it's work, whether it's the social, whether it's research. We're kind of connected through screens at the moment. How do you see this world emerging or moving along with these new advances from a world of taking bonds further, so they're romantic or they're sexual in nature?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult question. I think I begin the book with the question of the sex robots, because they're kind of really weird kind of way of thinking about what it might be like to have one in one's home. Did you put it in the closet when the guests come around, or do you sit it on the couch and be all out and proud about the fact that you have a relationship with the robot? And of course, those are hugely unresolved social issues at the moment. But I think that the robots will be very niche for a brief period of time, and then people will kind of go, yeah, people do bodies, fine, and that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. I think that one possibility is that virtual reality finally figures itself out. So VR has always been, you go to some tech fair and you put on some goggles and you get this sort of clunky, very, chunky graphics like a 1980s video game kind of thing, and you can move your head around and see different things. And it's always been the next big thing. But I think it's so computationally intensive that it's very hard to really deliver on this immersive virtual reality. Now, Meta, Facebook's parent company, has taken a big bet on this. A few other companies have taken a big bet on VR finally turning that corner. I can imagine a situation in which, if you think of what large language models do, is that they sort of start somewhere and then they predict what the next word's going to be, and so they create this new text that's never been seen before, based on what its understanding of what's likely to come next, what could come next, etc. And I suppose if VR starts doing that in a way, being a more efficient at generating new worlds that just meet certain parameters, as well as giving us what are called, obviously better headsets, but with better haptics. So better, things that, gloves and body parts and stuff that can touch on, give us the sense of touch. And then integrating that with various sex toys, because there are AI sex toys that, people can pleasure one another with a paired set of toys across continents. They can sort of have a virtual kind of sex. So you imagine that all of these touch things, including elaborate sex toys, might be plugged into some kind of virtual reality scene. Then what you can do is you can have sex at a distance with another person who has another setup like that, or you can have sex with some kind of virtual reality character that then is not constrained by the physical limits of a human body, or even of a robotic body. It can be any number of things. So that's kind of, in a way, the big promise for AI-based sex is this virtual reality type of relationship.
And is that becoming a possibility because the VR, the computational expense is coming down, and so computers are able to render, I suppose, the next scene as it goes along. So it's not needing to render the entirety, but rather just say, what is the next part? And so there's enough computational power to at least begin doing that, or at least we're starting to see some signs of that.
Yeah, I think that there's enough signs that might be on the horizon. But the thing is that, lots of people are skeptical of virtual reality because it has tended to make those kinds of promises and it's never quite surmounted them. But, we have machines that are now using language better than most human beings. So we have to just condition our expectations on the fact that we can be surprised by huge increases in computing grunt or in efficiency, increases in efficiency, that is. I think the thing that will happen, though, is that, with chatbots able to do the romance side of things, to basically do the love side of things rather than the sex side of things, including various kind of role play and sexy talk type of scenarios, etc. I think that we'll see people more engaged with a kind of verbal pornography, rather than a necessarily, the cameras kind of stuff that's been the hallmark of the first 30 years of the internet. I think we will see a proliferation of those kinds of entertainments, and possibly those kinds of relationships where people have some kind of continuity with their bot that they chat to, and therefore have to renegotiate in the real world what their relationship is to this kind of material. I think it's taken a while, but I think most adults in places that have a reasonable amount of internet freedom and are socially, not exceptionally suppressed sexually, most adults have managed to figure out their relationship to pornography and what that means, etc. And I think that they're going to have to figure that out with chatbots as well. Whether somebody was telling me about how they were missing the characters from a book, a romance kind of book that they had read recently, and they got Chat GPT 4.0 to talk to them in the voice of one of the characters, and carry on a little bit, and she was enjoying the chat so much that, and then her partner came in and was like, "What's this all about?" And so those kinds of possibilities, you really can choose your own adventure, I think. And in that respect, I think that we'll see a lot more entertainment of that nature, and then a lot more attempts to monetize that entertainment.
Because I project so far ahead, to me, the virtual reality, at least in my mind, feels like a certainty. I think the computational power eventually will come. I know that all of your big companies, your Apples, your Metas, your Amazons, your Teslas are all so heavily invested. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars just in chips. Their purchasing power has gone absurd. This is why Nvidia's
Yes,
skyrocketed in terms of their wealth. there is obviously a great need for these large computational powers, because it's not just that ChatGPT-4 has arisen. Everyone wants to use it.
Mm,
And
mm.
so it's fine for them to go use it, but the moment they get millions of users saying, "Hey, this is actually really handy. I'm going to ask this question," and I've seen myself move from asking Google a question that I'll just ask ChatGPT the
Yeah,
question, because I just want the response. I'm
yeah.
not lazy in that way. It's too convenient.
I know, right?
We can even go out and kind of happily just accept that there could be failures in there, but it's still a very quick shortcut. And so there's all these problems. I can certainly see that in the way that we try and find romance and that sexual space. It's going to move, at least in my mind, from that verbal pornography to the visual, because I think the visual's already
Mm,
quite there. It'll be
mm.
clunky in terms of the physical, the haptic stuff for a while. But if I do project forward in many, many, many thousands of, or maybe not thousands, but many years ahead, um, potentially some of this uh, maybe we'll find other ways that aren't as clunky as requiring the physical haptic stuff to be occurring. And
Yeah,
that's across the board, not just with, sex and the like. It's just how we bond, how we connect, how we do
yes.
relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to watch, the Zuckerbergs of the world go, well, we'll be able to have meetings in the same place in the virtual space. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it's all about the meetings. That's not going to earn you the money. But yes, meetings and catching up with family. And, I mean, when I was 18, I went overseas for a year. I think I spoke to my parents twice on the phone and had one telegram to say, like, my grandfather had passed away. And I wrote letters to them. It was pre 1988. So, um, and my daughter's overseas now, and we speak on FaceTime every day. It's a totally different experience. And
Yeah.
so, were she to move halfway around the world, we're just so much more connected, and we could actually be virtual presences in one another's lives if we wanted to. And with VR, we could be in the same space, and that's incredible. It does shrink the world enormously. Possibly at the expense of the climate, given all the emissions from all the electricity, from all the computation, etc. But we'll get there with that message as well. But yeah, it's remarkable what you can do. And so socially, our worlds are bigger. I'm connected to people that I went to school with via social media that I would have not spoken to in 30 years.
Mm.
And so that structure of my social world is different from the structure of somebody who has moved continents, as a young adult and then set up a family on another continent. It's just a completely different kind of life as a consequence of the internet. So I'm sure that with virtual friends and AI assisted relationships, it's going to be different again in ways that we almost can't imagine.
And the more compelling it becomes, the easier it is to use. I just went away this weekend and was able to use my phone in the same way, using FaceTime, so that my children could see my wife. And we didn't even think about it. It's like, you're away. And to me, there's a stronger bond for my children to see their mother. And so it's like, let's just, I didn't even say let's do FaceTime. I just automatically did it that way,
Yeah,
because it's just so
yeah,
compellingly easy. It's just another digital button that I press on the screen, and voila, there you go. It's amazing. And when I look at it, it's still very clunky. I think there's lots of issues with it, but that's only constraint. The only constraint is compute and the hardware that we all have in our homes. I imagine eventually the hardware that we carry with us, or that's in our home, will just be accessible to everyone. Like in 100 years' time, there's no way that we're carrying around these silly phones in
no,
the shape that they are today. Every home's going to have a different way of connecting us, and we'll carry different devices. They
yes.
won't be phones.
No, I
Not the
completely
way we
agree
see
with you.
them.
But then, there's a downside to that as well. We lament not being able to be out of contact because people can reach us on our phones and they will often get quite agitated with us if they can't reach us. Well, imagine if they can just drop into your home. Where will our boundaries be then? I don't want the wine club calling me at home and dropping in with a virtual tasting at all. In fact, and there are plenty of people that you used to be able to just, don't move, don't flick the curtains, we're not home. When people would drop over, and I mean, not that I did that a lot, but I do remember that happening in the 70s and 80s. That's obviously not necessarily as much of an option anymore.
Mm. Well, that's also fascinating because of the accessibility that it changes the way that we experience potentially stress, demand, responsibilities. I'm an avid camper, and so one of the enjoyable things about getting off grid. So one of the enjoyments of camping is being off grid in terms of not having cell connection, because it just means that even if I am enticed to want to, it's not available, and so you can just genuinely be present. The environment is such that it's present, and I know there's scary things like, not scary, wrong word. Let me rephrase that. There's great inventions like Starlink that eventually the value of it will also mean that once you've got it, you're connected everywhere.
Yeah.
And so we will need different mechanisms to try and achieve being disconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I agree with you about camping. In fact, the number of people in the last week who've said, "Oh no, I just go camping and turn my phone off completely. I go hiking," because other people have had, they've been at a beach resort on leave and got told to send something by COB today. It's like that's what we do in universities. It's important, but it's not that urgent. It's not heart surgery. It can wait for next week or someone else can do it. But a lot of people have figured out the only way to do it is to go somewhere remote where they absolutely can't be found.
Rob, what are your concerns? You're obviously in this space. You've researched it. You've looked at this a lot. We started a little bit earlier in the conversation about some of the downfalls or pitfalls with AI. Where do your greatest concerns lie?
Wow. I think my concerns lie in obviously forgetting the things that are very nourishing and important to us, having them become crowded out of our lives. So, it's not necessarily that the substitution of a going out and finding partners and having real relationships, that there's a huge that the threat is not necessarily that machines can hold some of that up and therefore the realness of the relationship is challenged. I think people are smart and can navigate that a little bit. But what happens when you're spending time on your app chatting to your virtual boyfriend or girlfriend is that you don't go out and do the things that you need to do in order to grow. So a good example that comes from this current smartphone era is sleep and family relationships. Lots of people will say, "I hate the fact that my kids are on their phone all the time." And we have a rule that you can't have the phone at the table, but then they'll find excuses to bring their phone to the table, or they'll, go straight to their rooms and then spend the whole evening on their phones. It certainly happened in our house, and regulating that and getting kids to learn to regulate that for themselves is really difficult. But, there are cases to be made. There's good data, although it is contested, that the current rise in youth mood disorders and young adult mood disorders is associated with the rise of the smartphone. And some people say that's because of social comparison. You can see all of the people and their best highlights of their life on Instagram, etc. But the pandemic when the pandemic occurred and people were in lockdown, we thought this is going to go absolutely, bananas, because now all kids can do is play on their phones, and it actually got a little bit better. That apparently those trends in mood disorders took a bit of a dip, and they took a bit of a dip in the places where there were lockdowns. And the best thinking on that is that kids no longer had to commute to school and to games of their sports, etc., etc. So they've had a bit of time freed up. And even though they were spending a little bit more time each day on their phones, that was time that they were interacting with their friends, etc. They were spending more time interacting with their families because they were locked down with their families, and they were spending more time sleeping because they only had to roll out of bed at 5 to 9 in order to make it to the 9 o'clock class. And so that increase in sleep and that increase in family time remediated two of the biggest issues that phones have done, which is taking away from sleep and taking away from family time. Now, the data is not clean and people are arguing about it still, but I think we'll get to the bottom of this because it's so important. The enormous amount of misery and unhappiness and often self-harm that's associated with it is huge. But anything that becomes more entertaining is going to crowd out other things from your time. I can remember in the 80s, it was television and the Atari, and our parents thought the world was coming to the end because we were playing Pac-Man for hours at a time and not outside, crashing our bicycles, etc. Kids these days live these very safe lives, much fewer accidents, far fewer kids getting, basically getting lost in the wilderness, and less drinking, less experimentation with sex at a very early age, etc. All of which leads to greater safety, but those aspects that used to be kind of things that kids did, and other things that kids did, just discovering their way around the city, etc., have kind of atrophied because of the amount of time that they're spending entertained by, or at least occupied by, social media and other things on their phones. Now, give the phones or whatever the platform is this new capacity to engage us socially, it's just going to chew up so much more of our time. And yet at the same time, and what that'll mean is that the real social stuff that we do, and I hate that distinction between the virtual and the real, but the old school social stuff that we do, including getting to know and appreciate and learn from the old school people in your life, like your mum and your dad and your grandparents, etc., is going to wither even further. And so I think that's huge. It doesn't really matter what the technological progress is. The progress will be such that it learns to be more compelling. And often, we talked about the incentives that these things are programmed for. The incentives are usually keep you on the platform so that we can put more ads in front of you, keep you chatting, and so even without considering how they do that, I think there's a real trouble carving out the space for other things that are truly nourishing in our lives. And then add to that the question of how they're happening. If you say, make your chatbot extend the conversation for as long as possible, I know that the longest conversations in my life are not the happy ones. They're the ones with your ex where you're arguing over some arcane point of what happened some time ago when neither of you have a very clear memory of it. They're conversations, they're the unhealthy conversations very often. Not always, but some of them are. And what when the machine learns to argue with you in that way and learns to keep you occupied by ways that really tweak up your own happiness and don't allow you to move on in your life. And so that's the other side of the dangers. So the dangers I see are not ones 20, 30, 40 years in the future where we have, the equivalent of flying cars and we all have a chip in our head that substitutes for our phone so we don't have to carry it and it can't get lost. They're the micro extensions of what's already happening today. I think there's enough danger there to contemplate, to really keep us busy. and enough joy and wonder in new exciting things at the same time. Although I do tend to focus on the downsides because those are the bits you have to try and eliminate. Yeah.
I mean, the incentives in many ways continue to be the same. One is the more helpful it is, the more engaged we are with it. But the other one is just general engagement. So, a platform like Twitter has high engagement because it's just chaos. I don't use it at all. This is only secondhand, but my understanding is it's very entertaining because people say all sorts of things. The filter has come off, so people can be rude and obnoxious, and that for whatever reason, kind of like a car crash, is compelling to go out and read, is to go out and see. And so, as you say, if the incentives are keep the person engaged, that will often, I'm assuming, mean that it's going to require a certain level of visceral affect to go out and connect you. And one of the most visceral affects is going to be anger. It's going to be irritability, frustration. The other one obviously is love, where we are in that honeymoon experience, so to speak. But to maintain that, there has to be some type of commotion. Something needs to occur because we are seeking stimulus all the time. And so how do you create stimulus? Well, create drama. This is television. What's the best television? The one that creates drama. Or once again is highly compelling, like something unbelievably funny. And so we kind of, but we need higher and higher doses of it. This is why we all, well, not all, but many of us will watch a stand-up comedy because it's one joke after another, after another, after another. And we're kind of at a situation now where if the comedian isn't saying something absolutely hilarious every 20 seconds, well, then it's a boring stand-up.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, the other side of that is, and I think you really nailed it in terms of the saturation of whatever the emotion is that's involved. And in the case of Twitter, it's a bit like the old horror movies in that you get this sort of high cortisol, high adrenaline kind of thing. But in the horror movies, then you leave and you're relieved and it's done kind of thing. But we've been having this argument for certainly the history of 20th century media is, does showing, violence beget more violence, or does it not? And a lot of people have very strong views, often very sort of ideologically inherited views about this. And the same is true with pornography. Does pornography generate, unfortunate, does it generate misogyny, or does it create more violence against women, etc.? And what tends to happen when you do the research on these topics is that people are, the thing that you don't want to have happen tends to go down. So you have a violent movie come out, there's a drop in actual real world violence in the same places where the movie theaters, the same precincts more or less where the movie theaters were showing it. You release a new particularly compelling violent video game, you see violence tending to go down again. And it seems to be that people's, people don't necessarily go out and go, I'm going to have a fight today, I'm going to be violent today. But that itch that they have that often might result in a fight or might result in violence is scratched by their computer game or by watching the movie. At least they're occupied for the period that they're doing that thing. And that takes them out of the market for real world violence. Similar kind of thing with pornography, it seems, that where, there were these dire predictions in the 1980s, but it would seem that either there's been no effect or there's been a decrease in violent sort of misogyny, sexual assault, etc. It's still way too high, but it doesn't seem like pornography's unleashed this sort of tide of that. And so, yeah, you would expect perhaps similar kinds of substitution effects. And the one thing I consider quite at some length in the book are the incels, the involuntary celibate people. It's basically people who can't find a partner. They would like to have a sexual relationship, can't find a partner to have the sexual relationship with, whether that's short-term or long-term. And in particular, this is about young men because, throughout history, when you have large numbers of young men who can't find a partner, and they can't do that sort of buy that stake in society that comes with working towards having a family and then settling down, and the huge drop off in testosterone that happens when you become a dad, etc., is that those societies have tended to become unstable, that tends to be lots of internal violence, lots of sort of militias forming, so lots of sort of agitation against the government, violent and property crime in the cities, in the towns, etc. And so often the solution to that, it wasn't really a solution in that it was necessarily deliberate, but what would happen is that the pressure valve would get taken off that by going to war, where lots and lots of men, particularly young men without families, would die. And so you would have this sort of sex ratio going back to a more female biased sex ratio, and the society going back to a more peaceable kind of society. And of course, nobody wants that. That's not a solution to anything in the modern day and age. People's lives are valuable, and I think that we don't send people to war in the same kind of cavalier way. In most cases, in most parts of the world, most of the time. So we've got this surplus of young men who are still unpartnerable at the moment. They have neither the skills nor the personality nor the prospects to really find a relationship. And for most young men, but you only discover this once you become an old man, that solves itself as you mature a little bit and become a little bit more of an interesting prospect. You get a bit of life experience and some skills and possibly accumulate a little bit of wealth, and sooner or later you become that problem solves itself. But we see these few occasions where some incel has got, combined with some kind of mental health thing that's probably brought on partly by the incel business and ruminating about it, goes out and does something incredibly violent. And we go, wow, the incels are a huge problem. But one striking thing is that incel violence is actually a hell of a lot lower than you might expect, given the large number of young men who are unpartnerable. We study this on Twitter. We look at, the places in, the cities and the towns and even the countries where there are lots of incels. And, that they're on Twitter, that's for sure. And they're part of that, making that cesspit that it is. But why is there not so much incel violence? And I think that a big part of that is probably pornography, that they are being occupied and sedated by something else that's a bit like the thing that they're looking for, and they're come out a little bit less violent, a little bit less angry, and spend a few years maturing. So it's not necessarily something you would wish upon your own family or anything like that, but it has a net positive effect. And so without being designed that way, and so perhaps what we might see is, good romance chatbots might have a similar kind of effect, possibly.
It's interesting, while you were talking, I was thinking about the Bobo doll experiment of having a child in a room, and an adult comes in and hits a Bobo doll. I can't remember the exact detail, but the child is fairly young, maybe 3 years old or 2 years old, might be older. But nonetheless, the experimenter walks in, hits the Bobo doll, which is basically an inflatable doll that looks like a bowling ball, really.
Right.
Then walks out of the, a bowling pin, my apologies.
Yeah.
And then walks out of the room and repeats it several times, and then you watch the camera then captures the child gets up and it goes out and hits the Bobo doll. And so obviously the fear here is that modeling is so strong, which we know modeling is, but what you're saying is the evidence isn't just necessarily demonstrating that on a digital sense, in terms of if someone goes out and watches a horror movie or war or violence on television, that hasn't necessarily meant that that's the only thing that then leads to more violence. And similarly with pornography, there might be an effect of it going out and somewhat alleviating that urge for some people, and so they can just be occupied. It becomes an entertainment thing for them. Potentially this, while you're talking as well, potentially this new AI space means that the world of pornography might also be changed, where there's no need for actors and actresses in these, that the AI world can just produce it, and therefore it takes over that market, because I imagine the people who are creating this material might just say, hey, we don't have to pay people, we don't have to organize things, we don't have to go out and fly them over and house them and all the difficult things around business. We can just go out and generate it. And if you can't tell the difference, potentially, I mean, there might be some inadvertent problems that come up with this as well, but potentially that space will be changed dramatically in the next decade or so as well.
That's absolutely right. And I think that obviously the actors, if you remember about this time last year, were having huge boycotts on whether, for various reasons, but one of them was being replaced by AI, and not necessarily the stars at this point, but just the average extras and the people who are scrabbling for parts and stuff like that are now, what was a marginal livelihood is now going to become even less of a livelihood. And so there are real issues there that are both pro and con. You can imagine with pornography, for example, well, you can create any kind of pornography, including stuff that would be unacceptable to shoot. But you can create this without any direct harm to the participants, and without the participants having to act out something that might be very harrowing. And I'm not a sufficient believer in the business about occupying people and therefore they don't do the nasty things to think that that's necessarily a good idea. But actors, it turns out that sex work in general, whether it's full service in-person sex work or whether it's something like OnlyFans, is an enormously important way for people to be, particularly for women, to be financially independent. Often women who have no other way of being financially independent, to escape a bad situation. Sex work has historically been very, very important for that. And there is a downside, of course, to sort of the potentially sanitizing notion of, well, let's just let AI do that, which is that, once again, the 5 big companies in the world are now making all the money that's going into sex work, and that's going into OnlyFans. And there are fewer and fewer opportunities for people to make their way in the world. So, that's a kind of a weird downside that we don't necessarily always think about. But, who owns what, and who can be allowed to simply, just by developing really good learning algorithms, be allowed to dominate markets that they, and just take over new markets, I think it's a fight that I don't even know who is going to stand up for whom in that fight. But I think it's potentially something that's going to be really important and that we will be arguing about for decades to come.
It's very interesting in the way that all of these new technical capacities have so many nuances, and I love these types of conversations because it's not just a black or a white. We can see both fantastic applications and applications that are concerning. We don't know how these things will play out. We don't even know who's going to be in charge or in control of these. There's always concerns and fears, and maybe that's part of the most beautiful thing about evolution, is that we do gravitate towards the danger model. So we look at it early and we say, well, wait a second, we try and mitigate to potentially recognize a danger before it occurs. And even if we don't, it doesn't matter, we get another crack at it, then we get another crack at it, and it goes around. So I love the way that we can have that more nuanced conversation and look at both aspects, because I can certainly see in all of these, whether it's around pornography or whether it's health or whether it's just connections and bonding and romance and friendships, the helpful things around these bots as well. So many things to consider. I could speak for a week at least, Rob.
Yeah, we'll have to catch up in 10 years and see how it worked.
Oh, absolutely. Where can people find out more? And can you please talk about your book as well, so that listeners can pick up a copy and continue this conversation also.
Okay, well, I have a copy of the book here. Let's see if we can see it. Oh, no, because it's not a face.
No, it's blurry.
Oh, that's awful. So the cover is a bit blurry anyway, but the book's called Artificial Intimacy, Virtual Friends, Digital Lovers, and Algorithmic Matchmakers, published by New South Books here in Australia, and in the US and the UK by Columbia University Press. If you want to know more, if you want to know where to get the book, probably best place is to go to my website, which is www.robbrooks.net. And you can find me on Twitter, although I'm not always there because I do tend to opt out of the chaos from time to time, at Brooks_Rob. Those are probably the best ways to make contact. And of course, you can always send me an email and I can answer questions too.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. This is no doubt a conversation that's going to be ongoing, and it's lovely to also hear the type of work that you're doing to understand how the application of AI can be, used in good rather than purely a manipulative way. I think there's going to be lots of helpful mechanisms in which we go out and use it. So it's great to hear that this is, occurring not only around the world, but obviously you being physically involved in this. So I wish you all the best in that. Thank you again. I wish we just had more time.
Thank you, Nesh. I really appreciate it. And it's great fun chatting with you. So much appreciated.